Imagine a world where the concept of water isn't a tap you turn, but a question you answer with your life. In the Apache territories of 1870, a simple morning wash wasn't just a luxury. It was a calculation that could get you killed. The desert doesn't care about your hygiene. It cares about your blood staying inside your body. And every gallon of water you waste on cleanliness is a gallon you won't have when the sun turns the sky into hammered copper and your tongue swells in your mouth like a foreign object. In the scorched basin of what would become Arizona and New Mexico, where the American frontier collided with the last unconquered indigenous resistance, the bathroom was a concept that belonged to a different universe entirely. Here, in 1870, as the US military pushed relentlessly into Apache homelands and settlers arrived with dreams of taming a landscape that had no interest in being tamed, the basic human functions we consider private, sanitary, and resolved became matters of survival strategy, cultural collision, and brutal improvisation. The Apache had lived in this terrain for centuries, and they had solved the water problem with a knowledge so precise it looked like magic to the outsiders who stumbled, died, and occasionally survived in their territory. They knew every seep, every hidden spring, every rock depression that held rainwater for 3 days after a storm. Water wasn't something you used to wash. Water was something you carried in your gut, rationed in animal bladders, and protected with your life. A warrior could travel for days on a single mouthful, knowing exactly when to swallow, when to swish, when to spit into his palm and rub it on his face to keep the skin from cracking open in the relentless, moisture-sucking wind. But for the soldiers stationed in frontier forts, for the settlers in their isolated homesteads, for the miners and traders and desperados who poured into the Southwest, chasing silver and land, and the myth of the empty frontier, the absence of water created a hygiene crisis that defined every moment of their existence. Fort Bowie, Fort Apache, Camp Grant. These military outposts were islands of attempted civilization in a sea of dust, and the men stationed there lived in a state of perpetual filth that would be unrecognizable to anyone from their home states. A soldier's morning routine began not with water, but with sand. You would rub dry sand on your face and hands, using the abrasive grit to scrape away the accumulated sweat, dust, and skin oils that had bonded into a kind of biological cement overnight. This wasn't cleanliness. This was damage control. The sand left your skin raw, reddened, and sometimes bleeding, but it removed the surface layer of grime that would otherwise attract flies. And in Apache territory, flies were not just annoying. They were vectors of death, carrying dysentery, typhoid, and infections that could turn a small cut into a gangrenous horror within days. If you were lucky enough to be near one of the rare water sources, you might splash a cupful on your face, but never more. The military allocated water with a strictness that bordered on cruelty. 1 canteen per day per man, and that canteen had to cover drinking, cooking, and any personal hygiene you could manage. Most men chose to drink it all, reasoning that staying hydrated was more important than washing, and they were absolutely correct. Dehydration in the Southwest could kill you in hours. Dirt took longer, but this created its own cascade of problems. Without regular washing, the human body becomes a terrain of its own, a landscape of bacterial colonies, fungal blooms, and parasitic infestations that thrive in the warm, moist environments of armpits, groins, and feet. Soldiers suffered from chronic skin conditions that had no names, only symptoms. Weeping sores, cracked fissures that never healed, rashes that spread like wildfire through the barracks. The standard military wool uniform, designed for the climate of Washington, D.C., became a torture device in the Arizona heat, trapping sweat against the skin and creating a perfect incubator for every microorganism that evolution had equipped to consume human flesh. The Apache, by contrast, wore minimal clothing, leather breechcloths, hide moccasins, and little else, allowing their skin to breathe and their sweat to evaporate instantly in the dry air. They understood something the US military refused to learn. In the desert, less is more. But for the soldiers, stripping down was not an option. Military discipline demanded full uniform at all times, and so they marched, fought, and died wrapped in their own portable swamps, their bodies rotting from the outside in, while they remained technically alive. The question that haunted every person in this territory, native and newcomer alike, was not how to stay clean. It was how to stay alive long enough for cleanliness to matter. The management of human waste in Apache territory wasn't just unsanitary, it was tactical. Every pile of excrement was intelligence. The Apache could read a campsite's latrine area the way a general reads a map, determining how many people had stopped there, how long ago, whether they were healthy or sick, whether they were military or civilian, whether they were worth attacking or simply tracking. A column of cavalry left behind not just hoof prints, but a trail of biological markers that announced their numbers, their diet, their discipline, and their direction of travel with devastating accuracy. For the US military, this created an impossible dilemma. Proper sanitation required latrines, deep pits dug at designated distances from camp, used communally, and covered regularly to prevent disease. But every latrine was a beacon. It told the Apache exactly where the fort was, how many men it held, and when they were most vulnerable. Some commanders ordered latrines dug and filled daily, trying to minimize the intelligence value while maintaining some semblance of hygiene. Others abandoned the effort entirely, allowing men to scatter into the brush and handle their business wherever opportunity allowed, which solved the security problem, but created a disease nightmare that killed more soldiers than Apache arrows ever did. The settlers faced an even grimmer reality. An isolated homestead couldn't afford a proper outhouse, not because of the construction difficulty, but because any permanent structure was a target. The Apache raiding strategy focused on destroying the infrastructure of settlement, burning homes, killing livestock, and eliminating water sources. An outhouse, visible from a distance, was an advertisement of habitation, so families developed a grim routine. You walked out into the desert, far enough that the smell wouldn't attract predators to your dwelling, but not so far that you couldn't run back if you heard the warning cry. You carried a weapon, you watched the horizon, and you handled your business as quickly as humanly possible, because the desert had a way of punishing those who took their time. Without toilet paper, a luxury that wouldn't reach this territory for decades, the cleaning process defaulted to whatever the landscape provided. Smooth stones were the gold standard, preferably sun-warmed and water-worn, collected and hoarded like currency. Dry grass worked if you could find it, though the risk of rattlesnakes hiding in the clumps made every handful a gamble. Some used strips of cloth torn from clothing, but fabric was precious, and using it for this purpose meant giving up material that could be used for bandages, patches, or trade. The Apache used a different strategy entirely. They selected specific plants, yucca leaves, stripped and softened, or bundles of inner bark from cottonwood trees that had natural properties to clean and soothe. This knowledge was passed down through generations, a hygiene technology that the newcomers either never learned or actively rejected, assuming that their own methods, however brutal, were superior simply because they came from civilization. The result was a population, military, settler, and indigenous alike, that lived in constant, intimate contact with their own waste. Intestinal parasites were not just common, but virtually universal. Dysentery swept through military camps with such regularity that commanders factored it into their operational planning, knowing that at any given time, 20 to 30% of their men would be incapacitated by gastrointestinal distress. The combination of contaminated water sources, unwashed hands, and ineffective cleaning methods created a feedback loop of infection that no amount of discipline could break. But here's where the narrative twists into something unexpected. The Apache didn't suffer from these diseases at anywhere near the same rate. Their mortality from dysentery and cholera was a fraction of what the military experienced. despite living in the same environment and drinking from the same water sources. Why? Because their hygiene practices, invisible to outsiders and dismissed as primitive, were actually sophisticated responses to desert ecology. They knew which water sources were safe and which were poisoned by upstream contamination. They knew to bury waste away from water, downwind, and in shallow graves that would bake sterile in the sun within hours. They knew to wash hands with sand and specific plants that had antiseptic properties, creating a biological barrier that the soldiers, with their soap and water mentality, couldn't replicate in a waterless environment. The military doctors, trained in East Coast hospitals and convinced of their own superiority, couldn't understand why their men kept dying while the savages thrived. They blamed the Apache constitution, their supposed natural immunity, their different diet. They never considered that perhaps the Apache had simply figured out how to live in the desert while the army was still trying to import Philadelphia into Arizona. This created a psychological crisis that went beyond hygiene. The soldiers, suffering and sick, began to see the Apache not just as enemies, but as proof that civilization itself was a weakness. Some deserted, others went mad. A few, the ones who survived long enough, learned. The teeth told the story that mouths couldn't speak. By 1870, dental hygiene in Apache territory had become a marker of cultural collision so stark you could diagnose a person's origins by looking at their smile, or what remained of it. The soldiers and settlers arrived with mouths already compromised by the sugar-heavy diets of American civilization, their teeth softened by molasses and refined flour, riddled with cavities that the frontier would transform into abscesses. The Apache, subsisting on a diet of lean meat, mesquite beans and prickly pear fruit, had teeth that were worn down to nubs by the age of 40, but rarely rotted. The difference wasn't genetics, it was chemistry. Without access to even the crude tooth powders available back east, mixtures of chalk, ground charcoal, and salt, the frontier population resorted to methods that were simultaneously ingenious and horrifying. Soldiers chewed on twigs from specific trees, mesquite or willow, fraying the ends into primitive brushes and using the natural fibers to scrape their teeth. The Apache had been doing this for centuries. Selecting plants whose bark contained compounds that modern chemistry would later identify as natural antibacterials. But the soldiers, lacking traditional knowledge, often chose the wrong plants and ended up with splinters embedded in their gums, infections that spread into their jawbones, and pain that no amount of whiskey could fully suppress. When a tooth went bad in Apache territory, you had 3 options, and none of them involved a dentist. You could tie a string around the tooth and the other end to something solid, a horse, a door, a comrade's rifle, and yank. You could heat a knife until it glowed and burn the nerve dead, a procedure that smelled like roasting pork and left men screaming until they passed out. Or you could do nothing and wait for the infection to either kill the tooth's nerve through natural necrosis or kill you through sepsis. The latter happened with shocking frequency. More than one soldier died not from Apache raids or rattlesnake bites, but from a tooth infection that spread into his blood and cooked his brain with fever in the space of a week. The military did eventually assign surgeons to frontier posts, but these men were trained in amputation and bullet extraction, not dentistry. A tooth extraction performed by a military surgeon in 1870 Arizona was less a medical procedure than a violent wrestling match, often requiring 3 men to hold the victim down, while a 4th pulled with enough force to sometimes fracture the jaw in the process. Yet the Apache faced their own dental crisis, one that revealed the cruel calculus of survival in a resource-scarce environment. Their traditional diet, while cavity-resistant, was extraordinarily abrasive. The mesquite beans they ground into flour contained silica particles that wore down tooth enamel with the efficiency of sandpaper. By middle age, many Apache had teeth ground so flat that they struggled to process food effectively, leading to malnutrition, despite having adequate calories. This created a feedback loop. As their teeth failed, they had to rely more heavily on softer, processed foods traded from settlers and the military, which introduced the sugars and refined carbohydrates that caused the very cavities their traditional diet had prevented. The conquest wasn't just military, it was metabolic. The bathing situation had evolved into a cultural standoff that exposed the absurdity of frontier morality. The few water sources that could support bathing, hot springs scattered across the territory, became contested spaces. The Apache had used these springs for generations as ceremonial spaces, places of healing where bathing was ritual, not routine. When the military discovered them, they claimed them as their own, posting guards and restricting access. But here's the contradiction. The very officers who banned Apache from the springs often refused to use them themselves, considering full-body immersion dangerous to health, according to the same medical theories that had plagued medieval Europe. The belief persisted that opening the pores through hot water allowed disease to enter the body. So the springs sat there, guarded by men who wouldn't use them, forbidden to the people who understood their value, slowly accumulating the algae and mineral deposits that would eventually clog them entirely. The ultimate limit wasn't water, waste, or disease. It was time. The entire hygiene crisis of Apache territory in 1870 existed because two different relationships with time collided in the same landscape. The Apache operated on geological time, generations of accumulated knowledge about which plants healed, which water sources stayed clean, which seasons brought rain. Their hygiene practices weren't reactive, but prophylactic, built into a way of life that assumed you would be in this place forever, that your children's children would need the same springs, the same plants, the same knowledge. The settlers and soldiers operated on extraction time. They were there to take silver, land, glory, and leave. Their hygiene was triage, a desperate holding action until they could return to civilization or die trying. They didn't learn which plants were antiseptic because they didn't plan to stay long enough for it to matter. They fouled water sources because they assumed they'd move on before the consequences caught up. They built no infrastructure because infrastructure implied permanence, and permanence implied surrender to the desert. This temporal mismatch meant that every hygiene solution the military implemented made things worse in the long term. They dug wells near their forts, hitting water tables that the Apache had deliberately left untapped because they knew those aquifers were too shallow, too easily contaminated. Within months, those wells were poisoned by the latrine seepage the military's own hygiene regulations had created. They burned the desert vegetation to deny the Apache cover, destroying the very plants that could have treated their dysentery and skin infections. They hunted the wildlife to feed their men, eliminating the animal populations whose droppings had fertilized the antiseptic plants they'd already burned. The Apache watched this and understood something the invaders couldn't. The settlers were destroying the very resources that could have allowed them to survive. But sharing that knowledge would have meant helping their enemies establish permanent presence in their homeland. So they stayed silent and let the desert teach its own lessons. Those lessons were brutal. Fort Bowie's cemetery filled faster from disease than from combat. Settler families buried children who died from infected cuts that Apache children survived routinely. The technological and military superiority that the US brought to the conflict meant nothing against the biological reality of a landscape that required specific knowledge to survive. By the 1880s, the Apache Wars would end, not because the Apache were defeated militarily, but because the infrastructure of conquest finally arrived. Railroads bringing supplies, telegraphs coordinating troop movements, and most critically, industrial-scale water extraction that made permanent settlement barely possible. But even then, the hygiene crisis continued. The mining towns that sprouted across the territory were cesspools of typhoid and dysentery. their populations turning over every few years as men died and were replaced by new arrivals who hadn't yet learned what killed the previous inhabitants. What finally changed wasn't knowledge, but technology. The germ theory of disease, still controversial in 1870, became accepted science by 1900. Suddenly, the invisible killers had names. Bacteria, not miasma. The solution wasn't avoiding water, but purifying it, not sealing the pores, but washing the hands. Toilet paper, mass-produced and shipped by rail, arrived as a symbol of modernity that was also a genuine public health intervention. Plumbing, impossible in the scattered homesteads of the 1870s, became standard in the consolidated towns of the early 1900s. But the Apache knowledge, the plants, the springs, the understanding of desert ecology that had allowed them to thrive where the settlers struggled, was deliberately destroyed through forced assimilation, boarding schools, and the suppression of traditional practices. By the time mainstream science caught up and recognized that indigenous hygiene practices were actually sophisticated adaptations to arid environments, most of that knowledge had been lost. Today, when we look back at 1870 Apache territory, we shouldn't see a simple story of civilization bringing cleanliness to the savage frontier. We should see two hygiene systems in conflict, unadapted to the land over centuries, one trying to impose external solutions on an environment that rejected them. The settlers won the war but lost the hygiene battle, surviving not because their methods were superior, but because they could afford to keep replacing the dead until technology finally caught up with geography. The real tragedy isn't that people lived without showers or toilet paper. It's that the knowledge of how to live well without them was treated as worthless, precisely because it worked.